Welcome to Thriller Vault, where thriller writers tell their favorite stories. I'm your host, Phil Williams, and tonight I have a thrilling story for you titled The Biggest Scam in the History of the World. The cold wind whipped through the New Jersey train station. Passengers queued at the sleeper cars and coach cars. Exterior paint peeled off the train cars, exposing some rust. Conductors took tickets from the passengers. The interior was likely just as drab. Rail travel in 1910 was much more utilitarian than luxurious. I hunched into the cold wind, tilting my head down. I carried my small suitcase, filled with enough clothes for a few days. My stay would be 10 days, but they had promised uniforms to wear daily. At the end of the train was a lonely caboose, sitting still about 50 feet from the train and unconnected. This car was the polar opposite of the drab train cars in front. The black paint was fresh and glossy and accented with polished brass handrails, knobs, and window frames. The shades were drawn, obscuring the interior. Aldrich was written across the side in gold paint. A tall man wearing a black overcoat and a black hat stood sentry by the elaborate train car. He narrowed his eyes at me as I approached. I said, "I was told to meet here. I'm Charles Jefferson." I held out my hand. He stared at my hand with one side of his mouth raised. I knew that look of disgust very well. My dad taught me never to hold out my hand to a white man, but I was just as good as any man. I was educated in one of the grandest houses in New York City. My father was the butler, and the master of the house insisted that I be homeschooled along with his children. Of course, I couldn't go to boarding school with them, but I got the basics. That's all I needed to teach myself the rest. I'm glad my father's not alive to see what a disgrace I've become. I dropped my hand, and the man in black said, "Follow me." The man in black showed me inside the train car. Brass wall sconces illuminated the luxurious accommodation. Plush leather armchairs formed a sitting area smelling faintly of cigars. Velvet drapes framed the windows. A full bar ran along one wall. A large mahogany table sat before the bar, the table legs intricately carved like lion paws. A kitchen was visible beyond the bar. A hallway led away from the dining and living area, likely the sleeping quarters. The man led me through the kitchen to the servants' quarters. The room was barely bigger than a closet, with bunk beds built into the wall. A small bathroom was across the hall. The man in black didn't have to tell me the rules, but he made it clear that I was only to use that particular bathroom. I stowed my suitcase and changed into my uniform, which was a black suit with tails and white gloves. I used to complain to my father about the white gloves, ranting about the fact that white folks didn't want my black hands to touch anything they might touch. But my dad thought I needed to grow up. He told me about the white butlers and footmen who also wore gloves. I had said, "Then maybe they don't like poor people." My father had been a quiet, patient man, my polar opposite. I don't remember him ever losing his temper, but he did then. His entire body tensed. He pointed his craggy finger at me and said, "You don't know poor, boy. You've never worked from sun up to sundown in the fields without shoes. You've never missed a meal in your life. Your mother would be so disappointed, God rest her soul." My mother. She never meant anything to me. According to my father, she was an angel. They had been trying to have children for a decade before I finally came along. I was their miracle baby. But I wasn't a miracle. I was a curse. My first act on this earth was to kill my mother. After changing into my uniform, I met the other servant, George Young. Like his name, he was young. I guessed he was about my age, in his mid-20s. He had a long scar on his left cheek that I tried not to stare at, but not trying only made me stare more. George didn't seem to mind. He was a cook, which was good because that's where I was lacking. I had been a gardener, a footman, and a chauffeur, but never a cook. "I can't believe I got this job," George said as he dressed into his uniform. "I figured they'd want someone older." "Me too," I replied, not thinking about my age, but what I had done to lose my previous job as a footman. "A friend of a friend helped me out," I continued. Good thing, too. I need the money. When I first told my wife that I'd be missing Thanksgiving, she was madder than a wet hen, George replied. Then I told her what they were paying, and she smiled and said we'd have the best December Thanksgiving ever. After we were presentable, George readied the kitchen and bar for drinks and snacks once the VIPs were aboard. I waited outside, ready to play the role of porter. The first VIP marched to the train car wearing a long fur-collared coat and a top hat. He used a silver-tipped walking cane that didn't appear necessary. A collection of porters carried his luggage, while a small, bespectacled man walked beside him, taking notes. The VIP looked familiar to me, but I couldn't place him. The porters left the luggage at my feet and retreated. The man in black told me to take the man's luggage to room 1. I was not introduced to the man, but the man's secretary addressed him as Mr. Aldrich, to which Mr. Aldrich looked at his secretary with a look that could kill. The bespectacled secretary said, "I'm sorry, sir, I forgot. I'm not used to using first names." As I made several trips with Mr. Aldrich's luggage, I snuck glances at the man. His face looked so familiar. The beady, deep-set eyes, the bushy white mustache. It wasn't until the next VIP arrived and called him Nelson that I put 2 and 2 together. Mr. Aldrich was Nelson Aldrich, the Republican whip in the Senate and the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. 4 more VIPs arrived shortly thereafter, all with extensive luggage. The men ignored me entirely. They addressed each other by their first names: Nelson, Abe, Ben, Frank, and Henry. They were all middle-aged to older white men. They all carried themselves like important men, confident and self-assured. Frank said, "I am to be addressed as Orville." Henry smirked and replied, "And I am Wilbur." This was an obvious homage to the famous Wright brothers and the inventors of their flying machine. The conductor from the train called out, "All aboard!" Nelson scowled and said, "We are still waiting on Paul." As if on cue, a bald man with a bushy handlebar mustache marched toward the train car, carrying a shotgun case. The men greeted the final VIP, all using their first names only. Frank and Henry reiterated their Orville and Wilbur ruse. I worked quickly to carry Paul's luggage to his luxury room. The men entered the rail car and lounged on the leather armchairs. George took their drink orders. A double blast came from the train engine whistle. I looked through the front window by the kitchen, watching the train chug away from the station. I thought for sure the train would connect us before leaving. But then the train stopped and reversed, coming back to the station and connecting our luxury caboose with a slam of the couplers before pulling out of the station again. I doubted any of those passengers knew that they had VIPs in their caboose. The rest of the day and night had been busy, catering to the every whim of the 6 VIPs. It was just George and me with them. The man in black and even the various personal assistants and secretaries had been left behind. I tried to glean information about these men from their conversations. They talked about hunting, making fun of Paul, the man who had brought the shotgun case. Paul had laughed along with the good-natured ribbing and said, "I have never even fired a shotgun." They talked about Wall Street and banking. They talked a lot about banking procedures and policies, enough to make most men's eyes glaze over. But these 6 men were animated and excited about finance. It didn't take a detective to figure these VIPs were likely wealthy bankers and financiers. I had been taught to distrust banks, preferring to keep my cash in my mattress. My father had been wiped out twice in bank runs over the years, the first time in 1873 and then again in 1893. He proudly had his cash buried in the backyard during the 1907 panic. The next afternoon, as the train neared Raleigh, North Carolina, it slowed and stopped just outside the station terminal. Train crewmen threw a switch at the tracks, and the train engine reversed, pushing the caboose onto a siding. Then, the crew disconnected the caboose, and the train pulled away into the station at Raleigh. When the passengers unloaded at the Raleigh station, their train looked the same as it had when they'd boarded in New Jersey. Most, if not all of them, had no idea about the caboose they'd towed. They were picked up by another train and pulled to Atlanta, then to Savannah, and finally Brunswick, Georgia, which was a small fishing village on the Atlantic coast with a port that traded in cotton and lumber. The next morning, the Aldrich train car was parked in a siding at the Brunswick station. It stuck out like a sore thumb at the small rural station. It didn't take long to stir the local media. As the VIPs sipped their morning coffee, enjoying the sea breeze through the open windows, I moved the mountain of luggage to 4 awaiting cars. The VIPs exited the train car, and I grabbed my own suitcase. I glanced out the window of my tiny bedroom, and I saw a man jogging toward the VIPs. He held a notepad and pen in hand. I figured he was a reporter. The reporter spoke to Henry, a.k.a. Wilbur, just outside my window. "Mr. Davison, Jake Cross with the New Brunswick Herald. Why are you here with Senator Aldrich?" The other VIPs hurried to the cars, their heads bowed and shielded with their hats. Henry Davison was a thin-lipped man with squinty eyes, a rigid posture, and a white hat atop his head, the brim as rigid as his spine. Henry said, "We are here to duck hunt on Jekyll Island. It's just a little vacation among friends." The reporter narrowed his eyes. "Friends, huh? Sounds unlikely. You have 2 government officials cozying up with heads of various banks, not to mention those banks are supposed to be competitors in a free market." Henry clenched his jaw for a split second. "We set aside our work life to come together as friends." The reporter smirked. "I don't think the American public will see it that way." "What do you want?" "I have everything I need. Senator Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, you, Mr. Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Abraham Pyatt Andrew, assistant treasury secretary, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, a partner in Kuhn and Loeb. I'd say I have it all." "Who tipped you off?" Henry asked. The reporter chuckled. "A good reporter never reveals his sources." Henry gritted his teeth. "What do you want?" "The way I figure it, the 6 of you represent about a quarter of all the wealth in the world. And if you're fraternizing, it isn't for the good of humankind." Henry reached into his inside jacket pocket and showed the man a handful of gold coins. He said, "You have a choice. You can take this gold and forget what you saw today, or you can write your story, but beware, a quarter of the world's wealth wields more power than you can imagine." "Is that a threat?" "Of course not. It is simply a friendly warning. If you print your story, it will go no further than your local circulation. The people I represent own all the major newspapers. They will make sure you never work in the newspaper business ever again. They will bury you and your family in civil lawsuits." Henry held out the gold. "What will it be, Mr. Cross?" The reporter took the gold and skulked away. We drove the cars onto the ferry. We were the only ones going to Jekyll Island. After a short boat ride from the mainland, we arrived at the Jekyll Island dock. We drove off the ferry beyond the beach, past inland marshes, through a subtropical forest, and finally to the front gate of the rural hotel. Armed guards ushered us through the front gate. The Jekyll Island Club was a grand hotel with an expansive lawn, palm trees, flowers, and a turret that made the hotel appear castle-like at one end. I was hoping for more help at the hotel, but we only added one more servant, Wilson, an ancient man who told us what to do more than he lessened the workload. I can still picture him with his hands on his hips, watching and critiquing our every move. That night, in George's servants' quarters, I tried to talk to him about what I'd seen and heard earlier that day. "Did you see that reporter at the train station in New Brunswick?" I asked. George shrugged. "I saw 2 white men talking. Don't know what they was talking about, and I don't care. Ain't none of my business." I recapped the conversation as best I could. George eventually held up his hand and said, "That's white folk business. It don't concern me. It concerns everyone who has a bank account, everyone who has $1 in their pocket. Who knows what they could do? These men represent a quarter of all the wealth in the world. What do you think they're doing here?" Like I said, it don't concern me. I'm here to do a job and get paid. Then I'm going to go home to my wife and my baby, and we're going to have the best December Thanksgiving. Turkey and stuffing with all the fixins. Pumpkin pie, cherry pie, apple too. Hell, I'm going to buy every type of pie they got. I went back to my room. I tossed and turned that night, thinking about what these VIPs were up to. When I have trouble sleeping, it's usually because there's something important that I need to do or remember. Maybe I was supposed to remember what that reporter had said. So I wrote their names in my notebook and what I knew about them, most of the information coming from the reporter. Then I finally drifted off to sleep. At dinner the next evening, I delivered drinks to the smoking lounge. The lounge was filled with brown leather furniture, ornate lamps, and dark wood walls. The air was thick with cigar smoke. I tried to glean as much as I could from their conversation, slowly handing out the whiskey. Henry puffed on his cigar and said, "Competition is the biggest problem. Over the past 10 years, the number of banks in the U.S. has doubled to over 20,000. They're stealing our market share. If this continues," Henry shook his head, "it's in all of our best interest that this trend is reversed as soon as possible." "I agree," Benjamin Strong said, gesturing to Henry, his colleague at J.P. Morgan. "We must tilt the market in our favor." Ben had a stern face with deep laugh lines and a full head of dark hair. "It's not just competition from small banks," Frank Vanderlip said, the president of National City Bank. "Industry is becoming more and more self-sufficient. They are financing their operations from profits, not debt. If we can indebt industry and the consumers, we will own everything." "That is the problem with the U.S., Henry said. "People are too frugal and they don't trust the banks. Too many immigrants with a strong work ethic and an under-the-mattress mentality when it comes to money and credit." Frank downed his whiskey and said, "We need control over the interest rates. If we can lower interest rates, people will borrow more." Frank jiggled his glass to me. "This is also why we need to do away with the gold standard. We need total control of the money supply." I walked to Frank and filled his whiskey glass. "That is risky," Senator Aldrich said. "You risk destroying the currency. You risk bank runs. You risk the collapse of the entire banking system, not to mention the economy." I left the room, but I lingered just outside with an empty glass pressed to the door to magnify their voices. "Not if there was a central bank," Paul Warburg of Kuhn and Loeb said. "Ideally, we create a central bank that is endorsed and protected by the federal government to protect our interests, to keep competition minimal, and to bail out our members during the inevitable panics using taxpayer money. Then, if we can detach from the gold standard, if we can control the money supply, we'll be able to keep the panics to a minimum." "Why would the U.S. government help us?" Ben asked. "Because we'll provide the government with unlimited currency to protect and grow government power," Paul Warburg said. "Imagine having unlimited funds, Senator." "We'll have to transition from the gold standard to a fiat currency system to do that," Senator Nelson Aldrich replied. "At what cost?" Assistant Treasury Secretary Abraham Andrew asked. "Detaching from the gold standard would unleash unlimited government spending and create massive inflation. It would steal purchasing power from every citizen who has a dollar in their pocket." "The average citizen has no concept of inflation," Henry said. "If we can keep it low enough, say under 3%, nobody will notice. At 3% compounded inflation, that's effectively confiscating half of the value of every dollar in circulation every 14 years, Abe said. Henry laughed. "Our banks will be the biggest buildings in every major city in this country." "Everyone else loses," Abe said. The men all laughed. "We can't say that it's a central bank. It'll never pass," Abe said. "You are correct," Frank Vanderlip said. "I was thinking we could call it the Federal Reserve. To the public, it sounds like it is part of the government and that we are actually holding reserves. What are you doing? Wilson asked. I whipped around and dropped the whiskey glass on the wood floor. The glass shattered. The old servant glared at me, his bony arms crossed over his chest. Wilson said, I need to talk to you. In the kitchen. Now. I cleaned up the glass and hurried to the kitchen, my heart still thumping in my chest. I dropped off my tray and empty glasses at the bar with George, then went to the kitchen. I know what you were doing, Wilson said. I wasn't, Wilson cut me off. I was born at night, but not last night. You know why you're making 3 times what a footman makes anywhere else? I dipped my head. Wilson continued, because we're here to serve. That's it. We're not concerned about their affairs. In fact, we're paid not to notice their affairs. Wilson stuck a craggy finger in my face, reminding me of my father. Do I need to send you home? No, sir. Later that night, I couldn't sleep again. I transcribed everything I could remember about the conversation I heard in the smoking lounge. This Federal Reserve sounded like a fancy counterfeiting operation to me. I kept my nose clean the next few days. I did my work and tried to ignore the plotting by the bankers and politicians. Despite that, I still overheard that they were in unanimous agreement for this central bank masquerading as the Federal Reserve. They called it a Trojan horse. Once they were in, they could chip away at the gold standard. If they controlled the money, they didn't care who controlled the laws. On my 4th night on Jekyll Island, I served dinner to the men under a chandelier the size of a horse. I set plates of filet mignon, mashed potatoes, and carrots before each of the men. As I went around the table, Henry said, Inflation is the key to the transfer of wealth. Henry gestured to Abe. Abe said, everyone would lose except for us and the federal government. We have seen inflation all over the world since the beginning of money. The Romans created inflation by clipping coins and diluting the silver and gold coins with copper and steel. It's not detrimental to everyone. Obviously, we are the big winners in this environment, but anyone with wealth, anyone who can protect their wealth from inflation, stands to win. That's true, Abe said. Of course, tilting the board creates losers, too. Wage earners will have to work harder and harder, but their wages will buy less and less. This is immaterial to me, but I think we should consider it because, historically, empires rot from within. Too much inequality leads to revolution. I'd rather not end up with my head on a pike. That's why we set a low inflation target, Henry replied, which is why we must have control of the money supply. We control the money supply, we control inflation. Speculation in stock markets becomes much easier if we know whether we'll be tightening or loosening the money supply, Benjamin Strong said. Paul Warburg cut his rare steak. He held up a piece of meat, blood dripping on his plate. Timing is everything. The men laughed. I thought about everyone I ever cared about. My family, my friends, acquaintances. Everyone I knew was a wage earner. My stomach lurched. I left the dining room. I walked through the kitchen, where George cut the cheesecake under Wilson's watchful eye. I marched past them both toward the servants' quarters. Where are you going? Wilson called out. I didn't reply. I went to my tiny room, grabbed my suitcase from under the bed, and packed my things. Wilson entered my bedroom, with George watching from the hall. What is your problem, boy? Wilson asked. I'm leaving. I'm done here. I shut my suitcase and latched it. You won't get paid, not a single red cent, Wilson said. I grabbed my suitcase from the bed and faced Wilson. I don't care. Wilson frowned and said, You're not leaving tonight. Won't be a ferry until the morning. I cringed and set down my suitcase. Wilson pointed his craggy finger at me. You got one of 2 choices. You can leave now and sleep on the beach with the snakes and the crabs, or you can stay in this room until tomorrow. I stared at my feet and said, I'll stay here until tomorrow. Your room and your bathroom. That's it. I can't trust you anywhere else. I raised my gaze and said, I understand. That night, I wrote in my notebook, recreating the conversation I'd heard about inflation and the bankers controlling the money supply. A soft knock came to my door, startling me. I shoved my notebook under my mattress and went to the door. I opened the door and breathed a sigh of relief. It was George. Mind if I come in? George asked, still wearing his uniform at such a late hour. He held a plate with a large buttermilk biscuit. I stepped aside, feeling guilty about the dishes George likely did by himself. George shut the door behind him. He handed me the plate. I thought you might be hungry. Thanks. I'd missed the servants' dinner, and I was starving. I sat on my bed and ate pieces of biscuit. George moved the little wooden chair across from me and sat down. You sure you want to do this? George asked. We're halfway there. I swallowed and asked, how many people do you care about in this world? My wife and my little girl, my parents, my siblings. I got 7 of them. My wife's family, a few dozen friends, maybe 50, 60 people. Why? Are any of them rich? I asked. George chuckled. What do you think? I nodded. What if the men here were planning to break into the houses of everyone you love and steal half of all their money? George chuckled again. Half of nothing's nothing. I set my half-eaten biscuit aside. I'm serious, George. Do you know what inflation is? It's when prices go up. Not exactly. It's when the value of the money goes down. That's what they'll do. George narrowed his eyes. And how are they going to do that? They'll use their connections in the government to make a central bank called the Federal Reserve. Then they'll abolish the gold standard so they can print as much money as they want. So what? That's more money for everybody. I shook my head. That's not how it works. The more money they create, the less it's worth. Sounds like we'll all be in the same boat. More money, but it's worth less. Sounds like it'll all equal out. I shook my head again. The devil's in the details. People with property and businesses and gold and stocks, they can protect their wealth from inflation. The rest of us will just get poorer and poorer, while they take the purchasing power of our money like a thief in the night. It don't make no sense to worry about things we can't do nothing about. I reached under the mattress and removed my notebook. What if we could do something about it? George eyed my notebook and asked, What you got in there? I said, I wrote down everything they said. As soon as I get off this island, I'm going to the press, my congressman, my senator, my state representatives, my mayor. Hell, I'll hand out flyers on Wall Street if I have to. You could do the same. We could give the information to everyone we know. They could do the same. We could really do something. George pursed his lips. I was hoping for excitement, but his eyes looked sad, like a basset hound. Finally, he shook his head and stood from the chair. I can't. I have a family to think about. I stood from the bed and held up my notebook. This is for your family. George left my room without a word. I tossed and turned that night, brooding over George. Forget him, I thought. I don't need him. But I did need him. He could corroborate my story. Some of it, at least. Without him, it would be one man's servant against the most powerful cartel in the world. I finally fell asleep very late. I awoke with a start. Someone banged on my door, nearly taking off the hinges. Before I could answer the door, Wilson entered my bedroom with Henry Davison, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan and owner of Jekyll Island, right behind him, along with Senator Aldrich. The VIPs were dressed in their hunting attire that morning. It was the first time I'd seen them in something other than a suit. I figured if duck hunting was their alibi, they were smart to strengthen the alibi by making it true. I stood from my bed, wearing my shorts and t-shirt. What's happening? I asked. Did you steal gold coins from Mr. Wilbur? Wilson asked. I didn't steal anything from anybody, I replied, breathless. It felt like deja vu. I had been fired a few months ago from my job as a footman for stealing. Like last time, I had nothing to do with it. The wife had a problem. She stole things for no reason. which made her the perfect thief. Nobody ever suspected her. Why would someone who could buy everything steal anything? "He's missing 5 gold coins," Wilson continued. "If you don't return them, we will detain you and call the authorities." I put on my socks and pants while I talked. "This isn't right," I said. "I didn't take his coins. He gave them to that reporter at the train station." At the mention of the reporter, Wilbur, a.k.a. Henry, and Senator Aldrich gave each other a grave look. Wilson pivoted to the VIPs and asked, "What would you like to do?" I slipped on my shoes, the laces undone. Henry Davison said through gritted teeth, "We need the notebook." My stomach churned at the mention of my notebook. I wonder if they had been watching me somehow, or maybe George had told them. Wilson pivoted back to me and said, "Give me the notebook, boy." With a straight face, I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'll call security," Henry said. "Keep him here." Then Henry left my room. "Give us the notebook," Wilson said. "Don't make this more difficult than it has to be." I looked from Wilson to Senator Aldrich and back again, calculating the odds that these 2 old men could keep me in my little bedroom. I tied my shoes tight. While I was bent down, I grabbed the notebook from under the mattress and pushed through the men rather easily. "Where do you think you're going?" Wilson asked. I marched through the kitchen. I could have left through the side exit, but George was there, and I wasn't sure whose side he was on. Of all the men on Jekyll Island, George was the only one strong enough to hold me. Wilson and Henry Davison hurried after me. "Stop him! Stop him!" Henry called out. I continued through the living room toward the front door. Paul Warburg stood at the front door, also wearing hunting gear, his shotgun in hand. "Paul, stop him!" Henry called out. Paul's eyes bulged, and he raised his rifle in my direction, stopping me in my tracks. Wilson and Henry surrounded me. "Give me the notebook," Wilson said to my back. I remembered the VIPs ribbing Paul Warfield about not knowing how to hunt, or even how to shoot, so I took a chance. I continued to the front door as if Paul was holding a pillow instead of a gun, and my calculation was correct. He stepped aside and let me pass. "What are you doing?" Henry asked, annoyed. "It's not loaded," Paul replied. I opened the door to the most beautiful morning I'd ever seen. The sky was bright blue. The sun was warm, but the breeze was cool. Birds chirped. I took a deep breath of sea air and I ran. I sprinted toward the front gate, feeling giddy and high on adrenaline. As I neared the gate, I worried about the security guards, but I didn't see them at their post. It was then that a flash came from my right and crashed into me. I lay on the ground, writhing. The wind knocked out of me. George snatched the notebook from my grasp and stood from the ground. He wiped his slacks and waved the notebook toward Wilson and the money men. He shouted, "I got it! I got it!" As my breath came back, I peered up at George and asked, "Why?" George traced the scar on his cheek with his index finger. "These rich white men didn't slash my face and rob me." George held up my notebook. "They already paid me for this. You shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you." They let me leave Jekyll Island with my suitcase, but not my notebook. But I have a good memory. On the train ride back to New Jersey, I recreated what I had heard. I remembered everything. In the weeks and months and years and decades after, I did exactly what I told George I'd do. I wrote thousands of letters to newspapers and politicians, but nobody cared. I stood on street corners and handed out leaflets detailing the treachery of the money men, but nobody cared. I worked tirelessly for the rest of my long life, but in the end, it didn't matter. The money men did all the things they said they would, and quite a bit more. They won, humanity lost. The Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913, while many in Congress were at home with their families for Christmas break. The Federal Reserve funded and enabled every major war with inflation. The poor and middle class sent their sons to die in foreign lands and paid for it at home with the devaluing of the dollar and consequently their meager wages and savings. They manipulated the money supply, causing boom and busts in the economy and financial markets, all with insider knowledge of what they would do so they could profit at the expense of everyone else. The United States ended the gold standard in 1971. Since 1910, the number of commercial banks in the U.S. has declined from over 20,000 to 4,844. Since 1913, the dollar has lost 97% of its value due to inflation. Whenever there's been instability and bank runs, the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. taxpayer have been there to bail out the Federal Reserve member banks because, after all, they're too big to fail and the money men are too big to jail. The story of Charles Jefferson is complete fiction, but the background story of the bankers going to Jekyll Island to plot and scheme to create the Federal Reserve is very true. The bankers I named were there on that fateful week, representing a quarter of the world's wealth. I sourced the background information from G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Unfortunately, the stats I detailed were also true. Since 1913, the dollar has in fact lost 97% of its value. Thank you so much for listening and watching Thriller Vault. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I hope you all come back next Saturday for another episode.